Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Historical Research Digital History Seminar. My name is James Baker from the University of Southampton, and I'll be chairing this session alongside my fellow conveners, Alice and Mara, who are also here this evening. And we're really delighted this evening to welcome Tom Mullaney from Stanford to talk about the audacity of Chinese computing. Tom is a professor of history and of East Asian languages and cultures at Stanford. He's a Klug Chair of Technology and Society at Library of Congress and a Guggenheim Fellow. He's probably best known for his award-winning book, The Chinese Typewriter, which I've forgotten how many languages that's been translated into. But I think Tom is also known among many colleagues and distinguished for his kind of public outreach work and things he's done around demystifying academia and the historical profession. Tonight, Tom will be speaking for about 30 minutes, after which we'll have about another 30 minutes for Q&A. If you are new to the Digital History Seminar, welcome. If you're not, you will know that we have two ways of interacting during the course of the seminar. First is pop your questions in the chat as we go along, and I will pick them up at the end. Or if you prefer, raise your virtual hand or put something in the chat and I can bring you in to answer a question at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Tom.
Thank you very much for having me, and Alex, thank you for all the coordination that went into I think more than a year of discussion about this. I'm really happy that everything is materialized. So I'm going to be speaking about really two works. The book was mentioned, The Chinese Typewriter, which was published in 2017, and then The Chinese Computer, which came out last year. And these two books form effectively one argument, one arc that actually at the outset was a single book before it branched somewhere along the way. And what I'd like to start with is something from The Chinese Computer, but then we'll sort of be moving through the argumentative connective tissue between them as we move on. So in the book, I start with, there's a vignette in the beginning about a typing competition in the year 2013 in a Chinese city in Henan. And this is a typing competition like one would see anywhere in the world, a bunch of people at their Windows machines with a QWERTY keyboard in front of them. And they have a text that they need to transcribe, and whoever does so in the most efficient way, accurately and speed, will win the day. And so, this is actually a screenshot from one of the participants in this competition. You can see the text in Chinese, even if you don't read Chinese, that's fine. The text on top is what the person needs to copy. And then that sort of empty window in the bottom is the composition window. And then we have this thin bar, a pop-up menu bar on the bottom. And sort of before we move any further, it's probably pretty relevant to our discussion how it is that one uses a QWERTY keyboard with the letters of the Latin alphabet and about 60 keys to work with to input a language that, for the sake of rounding out, let's say, has 100,000 characters and is non-alphabetic. There is no alphabet or syllabary in written Chinese. So how does one do that? Effectively, it's a circular process of, you can think of it as criteria, candidates, confirmation. The user is providing criteria to the computer in the form of keystrokes of the letters of the Latin alphabet and space bars and enter. The computer program, which we'll talk about, is ingesting those keystrokes and using them to provide guesses, candidates, Chinese characters that the program thinks, and I'm using a little bit of anthropomorphic language, and I'll stop that soon, but thinks the user is after. This is the one you might want. And then it gets kicked back to the user in the form of the pop-up menu, where the user sees what options the computer thinks is a match, and then it's the user's final decision, in this case by typing the letter one, number 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9, or maybe a space bar and enter to confirm, yes, that is the character I want, or no, I need to take some further operations to find it. So what you'll see here, and I'll just play this now. This is an actual screencast of what it looks like. So in the pop-up menu, you can see letters of the Latin alphabet, DXA, EP, LHJ. It goes very fast, but that's primarily what every single Chinese computer user does. No one types in Chinese. There is no way to type in Chinese. That is not phenomenologically what is happening. What one is always entering, either letters of the Latin alphabet or Arabic numerals, or maybe swipes or pen strokes on using a stylus or a finger. That is the primary mode of interacting with all digital devices throughout the Chinese-speaking world. And then the pop-up menu is where you see the candidates that the program is presenting. And then as soon as the user confirms which of the characters they want, or even two characters at a time, they select it, and then it gets added to the composition window. The pop-up menu goes blank or empties out, and the process continues again. All right. So it is this recursive feedback loop process, and with these features. Now, oftentimes, especially when we're talking in predominantly an Anglophone, Latin alphabetic-centric world and audience, this comes as something of a surprise that there is such a seemingly cumbersome way of interacting with a digital device. I mean, my goodness, what could be simpler than the kind of what you type is what you get seeming immediacy of the Latin alphabet with the QWERTY keyboard and the English language. So if I type the cat bit the dog, I don't need to worry about any complex feedback loops or options or pop-up menus. What I type is what I get. What could be faster than that? So what I start out with is just pointing out that even with this circular feedback loop, the top speed of this 2013 competition, and really I just use that as an example in the book, there are others that we could, blows out of the water by far the fastest recorded speeds ever recorded in like the Guinness Book of World Records for English typing. The fastest Chinese inputter is faster than the fastest English typist. So how in the heck could that possibly be when this process is so mediated? If you think about the sort of etymology of the word media, it is something that is in between. So if something is much, much, much more highly mediated, in theory, that should elongate the distance and time it takes. If I don't know, if I'm in my bed and I'm cold and I place more layers between me and the outside world, I increase that distance. But in this case, more mediation results in a compression of time. And so, not to mention accuracy. So what is going on? How is it possible to achieve 3.7 Chinese characters every second using this highly mediated form? And that's the key of understanding Chinese computing as it stands today. So the audacity, the idea of the audacity of Chinese computing, we won't worry about this. We'll worry about the English translation of this. Comes from these two passages I'm about to show you. And again, I'm not saying that Zhang Guofeng is the father of Chinese computing or anything. There is actually any number of people from this era we could have cited. But just to contrast two quotes coming from the same year, 1989. And here we have a Chinese computer scientist, a sort of early figure in the story. And if you read the passage, you'll see it's a very confident statement, basically saying that in the near future, we will far surpass English, and that with leisurely keystrokes, we will reach or greatly outpace the speed of human speech. And this is at a time in 1989 when Chinese has not objectively surpassed in just recorded instances the top speeds in English typing. The idea here is we see the writing on the wall. Or the writing on the wall is this will exceed and it will continue to grow. Now contrast this against a passage by who is basically the grandfather of Chinese linguistics in at least the United States and many parts of the Western world, John DeFrancis, who in Visible Speech in the exact same year basically arrived at the exact opposite prognosis, which is there is not and believe never will be as efficient a system for inputting and outputting Chinese characters as for English. So how is it that someone who, this is not a China critic, this is not a person who is ill-informed on the Chinese language. He trained most of the now senior and even emeritus linguists, Chinese linguists working today. and he came to the wrong conclusion. How was he so wrong? And these Chinese computer engineers right? So to answer this question, we're going to use a kind of brief. I want to get to the Q&A as quickly as possible. So I will speak at a healthy but brisk pace. We're going to use a four-part structure here that was basically outlined by another individual by the name of Qi Yuan. And again, he is one of a few that sort of structured this. We're not assigning any, this is the Steve Jobs of this, and this is the Wozniak of that kind of nonsense. But he's a prominent figure in the inaugural journal of a very, very important journal in Chinese computing. It's called the Journal of Chinese Information Processing. And he outlines this in the inaugural issue. Basically says there are four eras of Chinese computing as defined by the main obstacle or challenge we need to overcome in each of these eras. The first era is just how do we get even one Chinese character into a digital environment? How do you input one? How do you print out one Chinese? How do you transmit one Chinese character? This is not self-evident. This is not an easy puzzle. But then the second chapter is once we've conquered this thing of digitizing even one character, what about two character compounds? The reason being that in modern Chinese, most words in Chinese are actually not one character long. They're two characters long. So the word for student is xue sheng, these two characters, not one. So maybe we could, having conquered the digitization of one character at a time, we can move on. The third chapter is even longer, and these are sentences. This is the idea of now that we've conquered this, could we move to longer passages, 4 characters, 8 characters, stanzas of poetry? How do we think at a larger level? And then the final is simply writing itself. And by the end of this, I'm going to make the case that China anticipated ChatGPT by about 60 years in terms of the concept of prompt engineering. That China, the Sinophone computing world, has been prompt engineering, this new terminology with generative AI, for about 60 years already, even before the advent of GPUs and all of the more advanced hardware tech of the story. So just briefly, and this is how we're going to move through it. From the zi to the ci to the ji to the wen, so the character to the compound to the sentence to writing. So the first, most basic problem, how do you get one character in? This is a problem that precedes computing, and it really becomes, I make the argument in Chinese typewriter that up until a certain point in history, Chinese language is not a problem technologically. The first printed book in human history is a Chinese book. Movable type was invented in China. Woodblock print allowed for a vast printing and book publishing world centuries before Western Europe. So Chinese was never a problem until we get to the realm of electric telegraphy and typewriting. That's when suddenly Chinese becomes a problem from a technological standpoint. If anyone's interested in the telegraphy part of it, I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A, but let's talk about the typewriter. So the typewriter, many of you may know, is an American post-Civil War precision engineering technology. It's the concept of writing with type is this notion that, well, we know how to set type, like in a Gutenberg letterpress style. And we have a font, and we have 40 copies of the lowercase e, and we have 50 copies of the lowercase a, and we have like 2 copies of the capital Z, and we set a page of type. We have to have a very large font to do that, though. It's very heavy, very costly, very time-consuming. What if we just took one of every letter and made one registration at a time? We write with type. That's a typewriter. That's all a typewriter is. And then this is not a U.S. history or business or history of capitalism sort of deal, but just as a freebie, after the American Civil War, all of these precision engineering firms that had made their money off of death and destruction and weaponry and so forth needed a new line of work. And so some of them went into, the production of sewing machines and eventually bicycles and things of this nature. And then at least a subset of them enter into this new precision engineering realm of typewriting, which is an incredibly complex machine with lots of tiny moving parts. And that's why you have a Remington rifle and Remington typewriter, Smith and Wesson for weaponry, Smith Corona. So there's a transition in that way. We're not going to go into it, but the early history of typewriting was the Wild West. It was this unbelievably weird world of all of these competing ways of building a typewriter. There were typewriters that were manipulated with one hand alone. There were typewriters that had no keyboard at all. You moved a stylus around like it's called an index typewriter. There were typewriters where the capital and lowercase were on one large keyboard. And then there is the typewriter that we came to know because it sort of everything else died out and left this one model behind, which is the single keyboard shift model, where you put the lowercase on the main keyboard and then you access the uppercase letters, the majuscules. You put the minuscules on the keyboard, you access the majuscules by pushing a shift key down. And that's the one that we came to know. And that's the one that was carried around the world in the sort of wake, sort of the pathways of imperialism and capitalism and colonialism to languages around the world. And companies like Remington and Olivetti were very, very proud of the fact that, Olivetti scrivono in tutte le lingue and all of these sorts of claims about universalism. There was one language, however, that all of these companies attempted and failed to break into the market, and that was Chinese. None of these Western style single shift keyboard typewriter companies ever broke into the Chinese market because effectively you can't get there from here. The model was already sort of epistemically violent with regard to Arabic and certain Southeast Asian languages and so forth. But approximations and compromises and outright transformations of these languages with a kind of almost colonial mindset was possible. But for Chinese, there was no breaking into this non-alphabetic, non-syllabic script with 100,000 characters if it had to be a keyboard-based machine. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a Chinese typewriter. There was. I wrote a book about it. This is what it looks like. It was an index typewriter. It was actually the mode of this keyboard is very similar. This typewriter is very similar to one of the ones in the opening decades. And the way that you used it, I'll describe later on if anyone's interested in how to use it. But there's no keyboard. You're moving this bed around and you're bringing the type mechanism, which is this little rectangular bar, over top of the character you want. And then you're depressing the green knob over here, and it kind of sucks this metal type into the chassis, inks it, strikes the surface, and then spits it back out in the hole where it was. And so here's a picture, a drawing of a Chinese typist at work. All right. So the idea right now is that China sort of takes this byway into this realm of non-keyboard interfaced mechanized type thing. So it's sort of a parallel history that is running at quite a distance from the global mainstream history of a keyboard-based, human-machine interaction world. Well, something changes along the way. We can come back to this. Is in 1947, an experimental prototype is revealed to the world, debuted to the world. It's a Chinese typewriter with a keyboard. Now, I just spent 5 minutes telling you that there can be no such thing as a Chinese typewriter with a keyboard. And I'm now showing you a Chinese typewriter with a keyboard. So kind of what gives? This was invented by Lin Yutang, pictured there with his daughter Lin Tai. He was a prominent writer and cultural critic and sort of almost cultural ambassador for parts of his life, living in New York. And he worked in close consultation with the companies Mercantile Linotype, to a certain extent IBM, and at great personal expense, but with a whole lot of support in engineering, he built this prototype called the Mingkuai, the clear and fast. So the reason that it's possible in this case to have a keyboard-based machine is because it does not behave in the way that any Remington or Olivetti or any typewriter in existence to that point worked. It was, in short, a mechanical version of the very thing I described at the outset of my talk. When you sit down at this machine and you depress a key, nothing would appear on the page, but you would hear some mechanisms moving inside the chassis of the machine. If you depress a second key, still nothing would appear on the page, but you would hear more things moving inside the chassis. You might think it's broken at that point, but after 2 keystrokes, what ends up happening is that in this little rectangular window at the center of the chassis of the machine, up to 8 Chinese characters would appear. It was the world's first pop-up menu. I don't mean China's first pop-up menu. I mean the world's first pop-up menu, pre-computational. And then with the final keystroke of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, 6, 7, 8, the person would then select which of those 8 characters, confirm which one is what, and then and only then would the machine register that character on the piece of paper. And where the characters are stored is in a metal hard drive inside the machine. which you can see on the right, these long octagonal metal bars with Chinese characters in mirror image across the surface, sort of bundled and then assembled into the sort of like rotating Ferris wheels inside Ferris wheels inside Ferris wheels contraption. And this was actually what was being manipulated with the keystrokes, was moving a certain subset of 8 of these into the type position and then finally selecting among them. So, and if you look at the Chinese, I'm sorry, so if you look at the keyboard, anyone here that has any background in Chinese, you'll know that these are not Chinese characters. Some of them are, and then some of them are freakishly weird. And the point is that the goal here is not what you type is what you get. When you depress one of these keys, the goal is not to type one of those symbols and have it appear. You are giving criteria to the machine. You're saying, I want a Chinese character that contains this structure. All right. We're not talking about the sound of Chinese characters. We're talking about their structural features. Once you find the characters that match the criteria, give them to me as candidates, and then I will confirm which of them I want. Now, this machine, he is sort of ill-fated. The civil war between the nationalists and the communists is really raging by 47. And by the time of 1949 of the Communist Revolution, and especially the outbreak of the Korean War, where Chinese communist soldiers are firing upon US military personnel and vice versa, is over. There is Mergenthaler linotype is out. No one is interested in backing this. Mao Zedong is talking about Romanizing the language, which would make this irrelevant. And so funding dries up, and Lin Yutang, despite efforts, goes bankrupt trying to push this through. And the machine is never seen but again. And actually, there's breaking news, but I'll save that for later. Despite the fact that it was a failure commercially, every subsequent machine, including the very first Chinese computer, which you're looking at right now, all use this same principle and have always from that point on. So here is the Sinotype, invented at MIT by a professor of electrical engineering, Samuel Caldwell. And the key here is, you'll notice on the QWERTY style keyboard there, that there are strokes of Chinese characters. But the goal is not to, spell piece by piece these things on a page. What you're doing is you're providing a graphical description. I want a character that you have in memory that matches the structural features of the criteria I'm providing for you. And the machine also had a pop-up menu that would allow you to confirm that, yes, that's the one I want before we commit it to the page. Or in this case, it was a photo typesetting system. So before we commit it to the photographic record. Here's another example of a keyboard-based composition pop-up menu system. This is probably my favorite example. This comes from 1972. This is Sinotype 2, the second generation of that MIT machine, in its presentation in Shanghai. And you'll quite see there's literally 2 computer monitors. One is the pop-up menu, and one is the composition. And then finally, in what is probably the first ever merger of these 2 worlds, the first ever computational pop-up menu, we have the merger around 1983-84, Sinotype 3, which was the first implementation on a Macintosh or an Apple of a Chinese text processor. And what you can see there is you have the composition window on the top, and then you have the input window on the bottom. And this is an input system based upon a numerical entry system. So by the 1970s, 80s, the problem of a single character is solved. And the way it's solved is we abandon the concept that has been dyed in the wool, especially of Western human machine and human computer interaction. We abandon the model of what you type is what you get. The secret sauce is you add mediation, you add this criteria candidacy confirmation loop, and lo and behold, it becomes possible to fit many tens of thousands of characters onto an incredibly small amount of real estate of a keyboard. If we were to use the model of what you type is what you get, we would need a keyboard the size of a building, 1 character for every key, for every Chinese character. We're not going to do it that way. But we're still pretty slow compared to Latin alphabetic scripts and many others. So what juice is left to squeeze in the orange? And the juice that's left to squeeze, and I'll start to pick up the pace here, is, as I mentioned, in modern Chinese, so not literary classical Chinese, think of it as like the counterpart of church Latin, let's say. In modern vernacular Chinese, most words in Chinese are actually built of 2 characters. So I mentioned, xue sheng is student, hui yuan is a meeting, kai hui to start a meeting, da xue, university, 2 characters. And that, from an information science standpoint, is a valuable thing that can be exploited. The way that we can try to exploit this is that, again, this is sort of ChatGPT large language model style, but instead of large language models, these are little language models, is every character independently has a sort of statistical frequency within the language. We say the word cat a lot more than we say the word aardvark in English. Similar thing, you have a long tail of probability and frequency for Chinese as well. But in addition to that, when you have a character already in the text, the probability of the very next character becomes something that can be calculated and can be exploited. So basically, we're going to start thinking, can we build in a predictive element to input where the machine is not only trying to figure out what character the user wants based upon their keyboard input, but then starts making suggestions to them based upon what was entered. So long story short, the idea here is that, this idea of Gmail giving you suggestions about how to respond, and that came out in like the 2010s or 2020s, that was part of Chinese computing from the 50s. The idea of predicting the very next character, purely for the idea of speeding it up. And this is an image not from the late 50s, but the 80s. And it's a drawing of a computer monitor for a system that existed. Up here in the top, if you can see my, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. But on the top here, next to the letter C, you'll see what is effectively supposed to be an input sequence. This is the composition window. And then on the bottom, you have the input menu. One of them is classic. One is trying to guess what character you want. But then the next two rows, this row lianxiangzi and lianxiangciju, these are the system using onboard statistical data that has to be hardwired into the program of guessing, well, since the last character the person entered was guo, country, the next most likely character would be jia or fang or ji or nei or wai or ying. And if we're right, if one of our guesses is right over here, the user doesn't have to enter any additional keystrokes to describe that character to us. They can simply select that from memory. All right. So it's rudimentary at this point because it's all baked into the system. But the fact is that this starts to get much, much, much more sophisticated very, very quickly. By the way, if anyone's interested in the Q&A, this too, as I talk about in the book, The Chinese Typewriter, this is invented in China pre-computationally during the era of mechanical Chinese typing. And if anyone's curious about that, I can cycle back. But sort of moving ahead over the course of the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, what ends up happening is that the sophistication of this predictive element of Chinese input gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And then the sort of digital libraries of characters, the digital dictionaries and lexicons that are baked into the input program are getting longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. And now we get to a point where if you install a Chinese input method editor, that's what it's called, which is just a program you can download from the internet, and it basically does the job of intercepting keystrokes. Now you can add plugins, and you can say, listen, I'm an aeronautical engineer. I want my input system to have 50,000 professional terms from the world of aeronautical engineering so that my input method can make better predictions about which thing that it's going to predict to me based upon highly technical language. That's a plugin now. There's a plugin for medicine. There's a plugin for engineering. There's a plugin for restaurants. There's a plugin for everything. And some of these plugins will have hundreds of thousands of entries in them. And these are the little language models that are making the system better and better and better at guessing what the very next language is. So by the 80s, the idea of how to handle two characters at a time is done, to the point where then the question becomes, where can we go from here? And into the 90s and then into the 2000s and on, input enters the cloud. The simplest way to put this is, if anyone here remembers the early days of the Google search bar, where everyone was like blown away that the Google search bar was trying to guess what search you were looking for based upon what the most popular searches were by everyone else using Google. It's that, but not for the Google search bar, for Microsoft Word or for your email, the pop-up menu itself. So if the Super Bowl just happened, I don't care about the Super Bowl, but millions of people do. And you're entering something about the Super, you're a journalist writing up on the Super Bowl and you're talking about this quarterback or that quarterback. The input system will now be able to intelligently make real-time recommendations based upon actual world, because now we have people that are using cloud input such that the predictive statistical models are being informed not just by the hardwired stuff just in your laptop, but by sort of usage by many millions and tens of millions of users. This is baked into Chinese input from the teens and actually early 2000s. And this is getting to the point of unbelievable sophistication when you put these two things together. This is one of my examples I use from the book. This Xiama Yin Junjiu. This is the first stanza, let's say, of a very famous Tang Dynasty poem. If I were to try to input this with the full phonetic input system, like a full spelling of it, it would be XIAMAYINJUNJIU, and then the system would have to guess. You don't need to do that, though. Just by entering the first letter of the Romanized version of each character, the system's like, I got you. I know that the only possible thing you could be looking for is this Tang Dynasty poem, and maybe there's a few other things that I could put your way. And that's because these poems are inside either the onboard computer database or they're part of the cloud input database. So this is how effectively we account for this radical difference in speed between the top Chinese input speeds and the top English language speeds. Effectively, Chinese input, because from the 19th century, has been attempting to sort of get as much juice out of the orange as possible in this catch-up race with the Latin alphabetic world of human machine and human computer interaction. This sort of anxiety-ridden period that was trying to look for any and all possible ways to juice a little bit more speed out of it, effectively led over the course of a century and a half, where Chinese input actually harnesses and exploits these little computers that we all have in front of us that, technically speaking, by 1980 standards are supercomputers, literally. The MacBook Pro that I have in front of me by 1980 standards was classified as a supercomputer. So basically, Chinese input harnesses computational potential, whereas English, French, Italian, German, Russian, Hebrew, many other alphabetic systems effectively treat MacBook Pros as really, really, really sleek mechanical Remingtons from the 19th century. So it's not just that in China people's fingers are faster or something of this nature. It is that the computational aspect of human computer interaction is actually part of the process instead of gently pushed to the side. Well, we don't have to stop here, and then I'll close and look forward to Q&A. Thus far, everything I've talked about involves an existential speed limit that, by definition, becomes the top speed that any human-computer interaction can achieve. And this would be the speed of human will, the speed of intentionality itself. So the idea is, in the era of the character, I already have a character in mind. I know which character I want, and now I need the computer to help me find it. But the maximum speed that we could achieve is, I thought of a character, it's there. All right, so it's the speed, not of thought, it's the speed of will, right? I know what I want. Same thing with two characters. I know that I want to write the word student, and therefore the maximum speed that the computer could achieve is that maximum speed of my will and my intention. I want the Tang Dynasty poem, you get the picture. Well, what happens if we sort of lift the speed limit of human will? That is generative AI. That is all generative AI is. It is human-computer interaction where one removes the speed limit of human will to the point where I enter something into the input menu. In the Western world, it's called prompts, but it's just an input. And I kind of know vaguely what I'm after, but in terms of the actual phrasing and rhetoric and vocabulary and length of words and stuff, I don't. And it's going to spit something back at me, and I'm going to say, yeah, that's actually kind of what I'm after, and well said. That's where we're talking about, and of course, Mid-Journey in the case of imagery, and now text to video and so forth. That's the notion. We have lifted the speed of human will And so now, and I know this because of cheating scandals that are raging through all of our universities, of someone entering in an input string, might be 10 words long, let's say, and out spits a 3,000 word little mini essay in the course of 60 seconds. Suddenly, we're talking about speeds not of 200 characters a minute or 250 characters a minute. We're talking about 20,000 characters a minute. And the reason that those speeds are being achieved is because we are no longer trying to catch up with human will. We are deciding we want computational systems to be effectively partners, and therefore we're going to move forward. Um, when this came out, when I remember in the spring, when this, the rollout of ChatGPT 2 years ago, I think it is now, came out, and everyone was blown away. What is this thing? What is prompting? What is prompt engineering? And I remember just laughing, being like, prompting is just by definition what you type is not what you get. It is a mode of human computer interaction where you're providing criteria. Something, a candidate is being given back to you, but it's still kicked back to the human being to say, yes, that's what I want, or I want to edit it a little bit. And realize that China has been prompt engineering for 60 years before the term existed. Now, generative AI, I'm not saying that generative AI was invented in China, that it is its own thing, but the mode of engagement with it and an understanding of what this is and how does one even interact with ChatGPT comes as a much starker shock to the Latin alphabetic world than it does to the Sinophone, and for that matter, many non-Western script worlds, because in essence, this mode of human computer interaction and human machine interaction was the name of the game long before ChatGPT showed up at all. Just to give you a sense before closing, I did a back of napkin calculation and realized, as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, no one in China types Chinese. No one. No one in the Chinese speaking world touches Chinese when they type. It's mediated through one or another system. What they're actually typing at any given moment is a string of Latin alphabetic scripts, or to a lesser extent, keystrokes. If you kind of tally conservatively all of that Latin alphabetic input feed and then literally printed it out, like as a piece, instead of letting it turn into this input, print it out on a piece of paper, it'd be larger than the holdings of the Library of Congress. That's how much of this mode of writing there exists in this planet right now. We're talking about a scale that is just phenomenal. And that, technically speaking, is now the dominant mode of computing worldwide. The vast majority of speakers on planet Earth, not just in China, use their QWERTY or QWERTY style keyboards more similar to the way that it's used in Shanghai than the way it's used by an English speaker in Kansas City, Missouri. Um, and so this is why in the book I try to make the case that we are in the incunabula period, the first 50 years of an entirely new epoch in writing, in which what you type is not what you get, is becoming the dominant mode that displaces a mode that dates all the way back to cuneiform tablets and Neolithic dragon bone characters in the history of writing. All right, thanks so much, and very excited for hearing some questions.
Thank you so much, Tom. Just a reminder to all who are here, questions please in the chat, or if you want to come in, just raise your hand or say and so in the chat. Whilst you're having a think, I will take a bit of chair's privilege to, I guess, thank you for sort of taking us through what strikes me as a kind of a parallel path that we, and by we here I guess mean the Latin typing world, have ignored, a kind of world where um a world where WYSIWYG works, right, but not WittyWig, if you want to use that way of saying it. And it's kind of replaced by this predictive mode of interactivity. So I wonder then, so taking aside the stuff you said at the end that's more about the future, I wonder, thinking historically here a little bit, is one of your arguments here about, or perhaps one of the implications of what you're talking about, that we are talking here about a fundamentally different mental model of mediating or interacting with computing systems? And thinking historically, I mean, does your work imply, or does your work speak to the idea that maybe the longevity, because you said the 50s, the 60s quite a lot, this kind of predictive model, that the kind of the longevity of that mental model has had a role in some way of kind of shaping social life and shaping ways of meaning making, that are quite important and profound for us to dig into?
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, simple answer is yes. I mean, so if you think about what we're talking about here is, to use kind of contemporary parlance, we're talking about human in the loop mediation. So if you think about, as opposed to forms of mediation where the implicit goal of mediation is to hide the fact that something is, it's mediation with the goal of the myth of immediacy. And we see this. I'll just use an example from pop culture, right? So when Tony Stark, when Iron Man is talking to, was it Jarvis, his AI, uh, it's this idea of, Jarvis, pull up a map of the city. Oh, map of the city, and all right, rotated 360 degrees, and then this idea that is really baked into assumptions of what human computer interaction is, that the goal is a world in which one is never one never sees the panes of glass anymore. It's just this idea of a manifestation of will. Yes, we understand from an engineering perspective that that it has to go through a cascade of encodings but we don't want to see that. The goal of mediation is to achieve this transparency, this immediacy, and that's got to be the best of all possible worlds. This is a mode that actually does have precedent in the English speaking world, but it's a very rarefied example in which, not by choice, but really by necessity, it's got to be kicked back to the person. Like Jarvis, imagine if Jarvis was like, Tony, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last word you said. Did you mean this or did you mean that? Like that never ever happens. Siri never asks us, I'm sorry, did you mean you wanted to write the idea is that Siri should get it right away. That's what mediation should be and is. And there is this question of, well, but what happens if it's kicked back to the person who posed the question or gave the command or whatever? Is that really always a question of slowing down, or is there something else that comes from this? And the example would be court stenography. So the steno typewriter, which dates back to the 19th century, and just steno itself, like hand stenography, uh, has maximum speeds that far outstrip anything that a QWERTY mechanical or electric typewriter can achieve. That's why you never ever see a court stenographer in any court of law with a QWERTY style keyboard. They have this special keyboard, which is called a stenotypist keyboard. It's a little tricky. I explain it in the book, but effectively what they're doing is they're recording it in code. But this code is one that's got certain abbreviations and condensations to the point where you can record like objection overruled in one depression of keys. Now the trade-off is when the paper, or now it's computational, but when the paper spits out of a stenotype machine, it's not naked eye readable yet. It's not plain text yet. There is a necessity to do one extra layer of translation from this kind of gobbledygook encoded primary transcript to the natural language of the trial at Nuremberg or whatever it is. But it turns out that even when you account for that additional cost of time and stuff, it still is phenomenally faster. So the idea here is those forms of human in the loop, forms of mediation, exist in lots of different contexts. But there tend to be very, very rarefied in the context of, say, the Latin alphabetic world, which seems that the telos in mind is that mediation should be immediate. Uh, and in the Chinese context, out of necessity, effectively the entire Sinophone world is a world of stenotypists. Everyone is a stenotypist in China.
That's a really fascinating parallel, actually. Yeah, I'm going to think through that. I have a question from William in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah.
What is speech to text software like in China? Was it explored as an alternative to the keyboard early on?
Yes, it's very robust, and it has incredibly good recorded sort of accuracy levels, not only for officially standard Chinese, but also for a number of Chinese so-called dialects, which in many ways are separate Chinese languages. And it was so text to speech was explored and is still being explored, and also stylus based, finger swipes or stylus swipes. So basically optical character recognition. has a very, very, very old history in Chinese computing as well. What's interesting about speech to text is, once again, the speed limit, there's a natural speed limit, which is no system, no speech to text system can ever exceed the speed of speech. And to the extent that in the 19th century and 20th century, the whole watchword of the tech world has been speed. Speed is a measure, machines as a measure of men in the Michael Addis sort of way. That even 19th century stenotype machines are by definition have maximum speeds that are in excess of the of normal maximums of human speech. So in the 19th century, we already found ways of exceeding the recording of speech through mechanical mediated ways. Um, but in some ways, we don't like that because it's too human in the loop. And so one of the interesting recourses of text to speech is text to speech also lets us live the myth of immediacy and achieve what we understand to be top speeds. But technically speaking, that to go that route would be to say, we actually value the immediacy over speed at some level, which would be sort of changing the nature of the game halfway, which is fun.
Thanks, Tom. And whilst you're on speed, I mean, I want to go back to your opening anecdote in a way. I mean, is these kind of speed typing competitions still a phenomena?
Yep.
Are these
Yep.
speed typing and what sort of role do they have in sort of, I don't know, political life, social life? Like, are they seen as? I'm curious about them as a kind of events that exist beyond the sort of the person winning and the speed and the prize, and their kind of
Yeah.
meaning ultimately.
So this ties to a part of your question as well. So the typing competitions have a strange relationship, an uneasy relationship with other forms of language politics. So on the one hand, uh, you know, it is a celebration of Chinese in the digital world, which of course is tied to ideas of industrial modernity, et cetera, 21st century, the digital age. Um, and it's also connected in some ways to what you might think of as sort of language patriotism, and which the state definitely has an interest in promoting. The love. If you saw in the back of the banner of that, there was a sort of a propaganda poster or a banner, and it's like "Love Chinese Characters" was the name of the kind of host campaign for this. But there's also an anxiety that surrounds digital Chinese in the Chinese context, which is that technically speaking, when someone can be, and many people are, really fast at typing Chinese, but if you were to hand them a pen or a pencil, they might be at wit's end to try to remember how to write Chinese by hand. Because again, in the digital world, no one writes Chinese, no one types Chinese directly. It is a mediated process. And this was actually the book starts with that. The Chinese computer starts with that. It's so-called character crisis, or the character amnesia crisis. This fear that in the digital age, people are forgetting how to write Chinese. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, of course, wanting to prove in advance that the Chinese language thrives in the 21st century digital environment, but also worried that it itself might be a contributing factor to the erosion of cultural tradition.
Thank you. And this is just a moment to remind those in the audience, including my fellow conveners, if they want to come in at any point, please do. Um, I guess the other question was on my mind, which is a sort of was about sort of how you got to this subject in the first place. So you spoke, I think one of the framings for what you spoke about today was framed around the present in relation to the past, I guess. And I'm curious about the extent to which these topics are things you're coming to reflecting through your kind of the present world in which you're seeing. For example, when you said towards the end, that more people interact with machines in this way than they do in a kind of what you type is what you get. Is that the kind of perspective which you kind of came to this as a subject area and kind of a drilling down, or did you
Yeah.
originally come at this kind of drilling upwards?
Definitely drilling up in the sense. I think the thing that got me here, and it took me a while to. So I write. A colleague in me, Chris Ray, wrote this book on the research process, and that comes from our own interactions with our own students and mentees, but also our own processes. So I always tell my students, so it's important for me to be honest. The first, 2 years of working on this project back in the 2000s, I knew I was absolutely head over heels. I knew this is what I was going to work on, but I didn't know why. I could lie. I could lie to granting agencies. I could lie to colleagues and dress it up. But as I think happens with most projects of any magnitude, you know it's a lie. You haven't put your finger on what it is that raises your heart rate for something. Eventually, I figured out what raises my heart rate for this, which is, and I put it's somewhere buried in one of the sentences in one of the two books. I'm amazed at how much meaninglessness it takes to make meaning work. And the way I would put that in a nutshell is for a watchmaker, the face of the watch is probably the least important part. Every now and then, like what the face of the watch is just an indication as to whether or not everything else you just did and spent your life figuring out how to do works. Uh, for us, the watch face is everything. It's the whole ball game. It's the heuristics of it. It's 12 o'clock. It's 12:05. It's 12:06. Uh, and that's, when we look at a piece of printed matter, the words are everything. Is this someone breaking? Is this a letter of resignation from my, someone I need? Is this a death certificate from my? It's this world of heuristics, and we tend to interact with the world as if it's first and foremost heuristic, but it's not. And it's not, because if you actually go through and all the people I studied in this, they spent most of their time kind of like in the inside the drop area and under the ceiling and in the walls and in the down in the city, the bowels of the city streets. They were dealing with like wires and sewage and electrical currents, and I'm using this stuff metaphorically. They spent very little amount of their time in the living room of meaning or looking at the clock face of meaning, and they spent 99% of their time in something that is it obviously is not a world of randomness. It is a world of precision, and it's a semiotic world. But as a colleague of mine here at Stanford, Miyako Inoue, would put, it's a material semiotics. It's not a heuristic semiotics that they spent all of their time in. And I think that that's probably what drew me in. Was this is a case study that would allow me to really follow around like a fly on the wall this incredibly large cast of characters who spent actually most of their waking time operating in the bowels of, like, in the gear shafts of meaning itself. And so when we say like, oh, they won, someone succeeded in making a computational system or a text processing system, like, okay, great. So now I can send a message, and I can write a book, and I can publish something in this, and I can participate in the world of heuristics. For the linguists and the engineers and the entrepreneurs and the eccentrics and stuff that are part of this story, that was just them kind of looking around, being like, okay, cool, it works, and then going back over into the room with all of that meaninglessness with respect to the living room of heuristics that we occupy and we assume text technologies are about. So I think that was it, because that's where these engineers, that's where a lot of these folks were going to have to live. How do we build a Chinese typewriter? How do we build a Chinese computer? Um, where they spent all their whole life inside those bowels, and I think that's what I dug my way through. And then, of course, all of these secondary, tertiary, quaternary repercussions, accumulate along the way, and in talks I foreground them. But if you're talking about origin story, I am really obsessed with. I think we spend far too much time imagining the world as meaningful, I guess. Alice, please. Oh, and then
Thank
yep.
you. It actually links to a little bit to what you were just talking about. I just wondered kind of what the price point was for each of these iterations and who would have been using them.
Yeah.
Kind of how widespread were they?
Yeah. So if we go back to so if we go back to say Sinotype, which was developed, sort of debuted in 1959, is a prototype of a computational, effectively the first computer, Chinese computer, is a computational photo typesetting system. It's a computationally controlled photo typesetting system. So I'm sure many in the audience will know this, but for those that don't, so photo typesetting is a World War II era technology that's coming out of especially the work of, well, before this actually Japan, but then France, and then we have these sort of expatriate French engineers that will take up shop in the East Coast of the US, and then effectively MIT and that whatever that corridor, or I forget what the name of the highway there is, becomes a sort of epicenter of photo typesetting. Photo typesetting is the technology that will beat out hot metal composing, which is Mergenthaler linotype. And Mergenthaler linotype and hot metal composing was the thing that put the nail in the coffin of the Gutenberg age. So after linotype and monotype, letterpress becomes a boutique thing that, arts books do and people do when they want to send out wedding invitations. So once we get to the realm of photo typesetting in the 1950s, this is a system that would be something that a publishing house would purchase. This would be a $1 million+ system, but one that is worth it because by having that, effectively, you would be able to completely reconfigure labor organization. So it's effectively what happens with Mergenthaler linotype in the 1920s when thousands upon thousands upon thousands of compositors and letterpress setters and newspapers are just laid off and replaced with a much, much smaller set of lino operators. So that system is, industrial scale, let's say. The first system, the first really commercially successful system in the story of the book is one that's developed by a Taiwanese American engineer, Dr. Chen Ye, who he came up through like IBM, but then he went off on his own and started one of the earliest Silicon Valley companies called Ideographics. And he develops again a computational publishing system with this Chinese input system and character generator and so forth. And he's selling this, he's B2B, he's a business to business sort of, he's selling it to publishing houses and newspaper firms. And so we're talking about, multi-million-dollar system. We have to get to the 80s to get to the place where it becomes possible for, non-work unit or companies to be the main purchasers for consumer electronics. But for example, by 84, 85, 86, we start to see the coming on board of text processing software and input systems and computer applications in Chinese that you could run on an Apple or that you could run on an IBM or something like that.
Thanks so much, Tom. We're running towards time. I know we've got a question from Alex in the chat about one of your teasers, and I think Michael's question is also going to be about one of your teasers. So can we start with
Sure.
Alex quickly about the early Chinese model?
Yeah, sure. So the Mingquai, basically, I'll be braggadocious about something which is tiny, so I hope you'll pardon. But like, if there's one person that spent their entire life, professional life nearly, studying this stuff, it's me. And I knew in my heart of hearts, absolute empirical solidity, that the Mingquai typewriter was lost. It was gone. And the best approximate answer that we had was that when Mergenthaler linotype moved offices back in like the 50s or 60s, that it was chucked. It was disposed of along the way. And in the book, I speculated that it's probably under, 200 feet of landfill in New Jersey somewhere because of where the offices were. 2 weeks ago, it was found in a basement in New York, the one and only prototype of this system. And so now it's been an amazing sort of scramble to learn about how it got there, to kind of give some counsel or advice. The first I saw that 50 people wrote to me. It's like, did you see the Facebook post? Did you see? The first thing I did was say, please write to me. Do not sell this at the buy now price on eBay. Otherwise, you're going to wake up the day after and want to jump off something high because you'll regret it. But just sort of doing my best to let the family in question know what they have in their possession, why it's so special, and putting them in contact with any number of potential homes for this where they could give it the proper proper care, conservation that it requires. But this is, I mean, in my world, this is like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, Gutenberg Bible, and uh, Enigma machine all wrapped up into one. It's unbelievable.
Your excitement is visible.
Yeah.
Amazing. I will hand over to Michael for the last question, and then we'll close.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to go back to one of the things you teased just at the beginning, which was the role the telegraph technologies played in this development as well. I think there's kind of an understanding that typewriters to word processors is a fairly understood development process, but I'd be really curious what role the telegraphy technologies played.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the simplest way to put it is uh, the telegraph is by virtue. So obviously you have the material infrastructure of telegraphy, you have the legal infrastructure of telegraphy of, the right landing rights and, and who's going to repair the line and can we put a pole on your farmland, that kind of stuff. But then, of course, there's the semiotic dimension of just Morse code. We need to take the natural language message, we need to translate it into something that is susceptible to being electrified, and then we need to move that. So, long story short, is for the first time in a large scale way, of course, uh, um, semaphore and flag waving and smoke signals and things have existed. Communication at a distance has existed, but this is going to be something that is global in scale and industrial at scale. And so, for the first time, participation in some kind of language technology, a large-scale language technology, requires that language in question be encoded in a stable Unicode style or ASCII style addressing system. Because again, you don't send language over a wire, you send code or addresses over a wire, and then it needs to be decoded at the end. So suddenly the spatial dimensions of language become the main criteria for sort of the pecking order of the best to worst languages out there. The simplest way to put it is if I gave you a wood block, if I gave you a plank for xylographic woodblock printing and I said, make Arabic, make Chinese, make English, it's like, cool, here I go. Uh, I can do that process. In the digital realm, it is okay, um, give me your language, but you have to give it to me in a set of addresses. Oh my gosh, you're an alphabetic language? Great. We only have to have 26 addresses or maybe, 26 plus capital. Oh my gosh, you're Chinese. You have 100,000 addresses. Suddenly there is a stark pecking order between you. So before the challenge of making a Chinese typewriter, how to fit a language with 100,000 characters onto a tabletop device, there was the precursor question of how to make Chinese Morse code. How do you fit tens of thousands of characters into a code that is sort of economical in that way? And that really defines the problem, the so-called problem of the digital age. And I'll close with a vignette, which I think I was very appreciative when I came across this because it gives me a metaphor to talk about. Before I removed TikTok from my phone, I remember there was a channel on there that the guy who runs the channel, I think it's a guy, he has like a precision scale. He has a scale that is accurate to like point zero, like 7 digits, right? It's a industrial lab scale. And all he does every video is a before and after. So he'll take a book or a piece of paper and then he'll weigh it and then he'll take it off and highlight one sentence and put it back on. And lo and behold, like in the seventh digit, it shows up as the difference. He'll unpack, like two different Hot Wheel cars fresh from the package and weigh one and weigh the other, and there'll be a difference. One of the videos that he did, and I did download this mercifully, is he takes a USB key that is empty, and then he weighs it, and then he takes a USB key and he shows himself loading all of these pictures of rocks onto the USB until it's full, and he puts it back on, and it weighs the same. The digital realm is the only realm of inscription that has ever existed in a sort of material inscription in which the entirety of the zone is pre-populated. All of the things that can be there are already there. If I switch 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, the different configuration of that, of course, allows me to create the special effects of pictures and all the stuff. But it has to be, by definition, pre-populated there. If I make a xylographic print, I am subtracting materiality. If I'm writing, if I'm a scriptoria, I am adding materiality. There is always this addition or subtraction of materiality at play. except for the digital. And the digital then funnels everything into this notion that everything that can be in the digital has to be in the digital from the moment you turn your computer on. And suddenly then that becomes this incredibly stark criteria that has led to an almost taken for granted assumption that some languages are simply better or more compatible with this requirement of the digital age than others. We saw a bit of that, a taste of that idea with the advent of movable type and people saying, wow, for English, we only need this many sorts in the font. And for Arabic, we need 200. For Hindi, we need 400. For Korean, we need 5,000. But in that era, there was always multimodality at play. Like the reason that China invented movable type and then quickly abandoned it wasn't the best tool for the job. And woodblock print was far better as a low cost, high quality mode of print. But now in the digital age, not only do we have this stark requirement that everything in the digital has to be in the digital from the moment we turn the computer on, this pre-population of materiality, but it's the only game in town. I mean, yes, you can go to a letterpress place and you can make pretty invitations for your wedding, doing letterpress class. But besides these little boutique case studies, everything now is routed into the digital world, which runs the risk, not the risk, it's just the reality now of a hierarchy of language that even 19th century race scientists didn't even dream with this sort of immaculate perfection. We have achieved in the digital age a sort of encoded belief system of the relative hierarchy, superiority, and inferiority of language vis-a-vis its compatibility with the digital age, and no one has to say a racist thing in the process. So we got all the racism without the racism, and this is a ghost, a demon of the digital age that's also one of the sort of issues that was at the heart of this, 16 years ago when I started. But that's telegraphy is the beginning of that mode of problem, because there is no way, and there has never been a way to transmit a message 5,000 miles at the speed of effectively the speed of light with some intermediation, unless you are talking about a system in which the entirety of the language in question is already in the system, and we are simply, electrically turning zeros and ones on and off in a certain configuration. And so that's where something got very, very stark. And then from that point on, the technologies of text have become less and less and less multimodal, even though they're audiovisual. But there's only one game in town, and that game is the digital. And that's a very stark world to live in from a perspective of the diversity of text and writing systems and languages out there.
What a thought-provoking place to end. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you
So
much.
hopefully everyone will join me in thanking Tom for a wonderful, stimulating, and very rich seminar. There's lots from here I'll take away, including that person putting stuff on scales and weighing them, which I'll probably have to try and find now. So thank you so much. It's been great, and thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
Before everyone leaves, just do a quick plug for the next seminar in our digital history series on the 11th of March, so a month from now. Julia King from Lambeth Palace Library will be talking about women's reading and community as a model for bibliographic network analysis. So I look forward to seeing many of you there, and we will be in person in London for that one, but also broadcasting online. So thank you again to Tom, and hopefully see some of you soon at a future seminar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.